London, April 1817. The parish of St. Bartholomew stood in the industrial shadows of the city, where coal smoke stained the buildings black and poverty clung to every corner like a persistent fog. Inside the modest charity house, Georgiana Rose Fletcher knelt beside a makeshift cot, cradling a child consumed by fever against her chest, as she murmured soft reassurances the boy was too young to comprehend. At 22 years of age, she had learned to find purpose in service, to measure her worth not by the ballrooms she would never enter, but by the lives she might touch with gentle hands and a compassionate heart. The door opened behind her, admitting a draught of cold April air and the measured footsteps of gentlemen unused to such humble surroundings. Georgiana did not turn, too absorbed in coaxing a few drops of willow bark tea between the child's cracked lips. She had grown accustomed to the parade of wealthy patrons who came to observe the charitable works they funded from a safe distance, their fine clothes and perfumed handkerchiefs protection against the reality of suffering they preferred to imagine rather than witness. What she could not have known was that Nicholas Henry Cavendish, Earl of Stratford, had stopped mid-stride the moment his eyes found her. Something in the tender curve of her shoulders, the infinite patience in her movements, the way she held that sick child as if he were an inestimable treasure in all of England, struck him with a force that rendered him suddenly immobile. If stories of impossible love and the courage to defy an empire move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. Nicholas had accompanied his mother on this visit, a quarterly penance of charity, to one of the many charities patronized by the Earl of Stratford's family, a duty he performed with the detached efficiency of a man whose thoughts were always elsewhere. In 6 months he would marry Princess Sophia of Hanover, a union arranged to strengthen political ties between England and the German states. It was a match of convenience and necessity, approved by the Prince Regent himself, and Nicholas had accepted it with the resignation of a man who understood that personal desires were sacrifices aristocrats were expected to make. Yet, watching this unknown young woman tend to the sick child with such evident devotion, Nicholas felt something stir within him that he had believed long resigned to slumber. She looked up then, perhaps sensing the weight of his gaze, and their eyes met across the crowded room. Georgiana saw a tall gentleman in his early 30s, dressed in the finest cloth she had ever witnessed, his dark hair slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it. His face was chiseled and remote in the manner of his class, but it was his eyes that arrested her attention. They held an intensity, a searching quality, as if he were looking not at her but into her, seeking something he had lost and did not know how to retrieve. The parish priest approached them with evident nervousness, his hands clasped before him in the humble manner of one addressing his betters. The man was Father William Duckett, a stout clergyman in his 50s of age who had dedicated his life to serving the poorest members of London society. He had known Georgiana since the day she arrived 3 years earlier, a young woman newly orphaned and seeking purpose in the ashes of her grief. "My lord," Father Duckett said, his voice carrying the slight tremor of anxiety that always accompanied interactions with the aristocracy. "May I present Miss Georgiana Fletcher, one of our most devoted volunteers. Miss Fletcher, this is the Earl of Stratford, whose family has been most generous to our humble parish." Georgiana rose carefully, settling the now sleeping child back onto his cot with a tenderness that did not go unnoticed by Nicholas. She curtsied as deeply as her worn dress would allow, keeping her eyes lowered, as was appropriate for one of her station addressing a man so far above her. The fabric of her gown, a simple grey muslin that had been mended more times than she could count, whispered softly as she moved. "My lord," she murmured, her voice soft but clear. "Your family's generosity has saved countless lives. We are deeply grateful." "How long have you served here, Miss Fletcher?" Nicholas asked, surprised by the steadiness of her voice, the quiet dignity she maintained, despite her obviously humble circumstances. 3 years, my lord," Georgiana replied, "since my parents passed and I found myself in need of purpose." "And you have found it here among the sick and suffering?" Georgiana raised her eyes to meet his then, and Nicholas saw in their grey depths a conviction that stirred a sharp discomfort within him. They were remarkable eyes, he realized, the color of storm clouds over the sea, framed by dark lashes that made them appear even more luminous in the dim light of the charity house. "I have found it in service to those who need it most, my lord," she said. "There is no greater privilege than to ease suffering where one finds it." Nicholas felt his mother's hand on his arm, drawing him away to continue their tour of the facility. The Dowager Countess of Stratford was a formidable woman in her 60s. Her bearing was rigidly correct despite her years, her face set in the perpetual expression of dignified reserve that came from a lifetime at the pinnacle of society. She had accompanied her son on this charitable visit, as was her custom, believing firmly that the aristocracy had obligations to those less fortunate, though she preferred to fulfill those obligations from a comfortable distance. A profound restlessness took root the moment he had seen Georgiana kneeling by that child's bedside. As they moved through the charity house, Nicholas's eyes searched and lingered repeatedly at the young woman, who had returned to her patient with the same focused attention she had shown before their interruption. He listened with half an ear as Father Duckett enumerated the parish's needs, the number of orphans they sheltered, the medical supplies they required, the challenges of feeding so many mouths with limited resources. The tour continued through narrow corridors that smelled of carbolic soap and illness, past rooms filled with cots, where other sick children lay in various states of recovery. They saw the small kitchen where volunteers prepared simple meals, the storeroom where donated clothing and blankets were kept, the cramped office where Father Duckett maintained his records of births and deaths, admissions and departures. It was a world entirely removed from the gilded drawing rooms and ballrooms Nicholas inhabited, yet it felt more real to him than anything he had experienced in months. 3 days later, Nicholas returned to St. Bartholomew's parish alone, claiming a need to inspect the renovations his family's donation would fund. The priest was delighted, though clearly surprised by such personal attention from a patron of the Earl's standing. Nicholas endured another tour of the facilities, this time paying genuine attention to the conditions and the work being done, but his eyes searched constantly for a glimpse of familiar grey eyes and gentle hands. He found her in the garden behind the charity house, a modest plot where Georgiana was teaching a group of older orphans to tend vegetables. The garden was perhaps 30 feet square, carved out of what had once been a neglected courtyard, now transformed into neat rows of planted beds separated by narrow paths of packed earth. She wore the same worn dress she had worn on his first visit, her hair pulled back in a simple bun that revealed the elegant line of her neck. Nicholas stood at the garden gate, watching as she knelt in the dirt beside a young girl of perhaps 10 years, demonstrating the proper depth to plant seed potatoes. "You must be gentle but firm," Georgiana was saying, her hands guiding the child's smaller ones. "The earth will nurture what you give it care, but you must show it respect. Tend them with patience and love, and they will grow strong." The simple wisdom in her words moved Nicholas more than any sermon he had heard in St. James's Chapel. He cleared his throat, and Georgiana looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to concern as she recognized him. "My lord," she said, rising quickly and brushing dirt from her hands onto her apron. "We did not expect you. Is something amiss with the renovations?" "Not at all," Nicholas assured her, suddenly aware of how irregular his presence must seem. "I merely wish to see more of the work your parish accomplishes. My mother spoke so highly of what she witnessed during our visit." It was not entirely a lie, though Nicholas knew his true motivation had nothing to do with his mother's opinions. The Dowager Countess had indeed commented favorably on the cleanliness of the facility and the evident dedication of the volunteers, but she had not mentioned the young woman with grey eyes who seemed to illuminate the dim charity house with her presence. "Would you show me your garden, Miss Fletcher?" he asked, gesturing to the neat rows of planted beds. "I confess I know very little of such practical matters." Georgiana hesitated, clearly uncertain of the propriety of such a request, but Father Duckett had appeared at Nicholas's shoulder, beaming with approval at the Earl's interest. "Of course, Miss Fletcher," the priest said. "Show his lordship our progress. We are most proud of the improvements you have made here." Over the following weeks, Nicholas found excuses to return to St. Bartholomew's parish with a frequency that began to raise eyebrows among his own household. His valet, a discreet man named Morrison who had served the Stratford family for 20 years, noted the Earl's unusual interest in charitable works, but said nothing. The household staff whispered among themselves, speculating about their master's sudden dedication to philanthropy, but none dared question him directly. Nicholas told himself he was being thorough in his oversight of the family's charitable works, that his engagement to Princess Sophia did not preclude him from taking personal interest in the well-being of the less fortunate. He told himself many things, but the truth was simpler and more dangerous. He was falling in love with Georgiana Fletcher. It happened gradually and then all at once, in the way of all-consuming passions that burn slowly before erupting into flame. He loved the way she spoke to the children, never condescending but treating even the youngest as people worthy of respect. He loved her laugh, which he heard rarely, but which transformed her entire face when it came, lighting her grey eyes from within like sun breaking through storm clouds. He loved the way she listened when he spoke, truly listened, as if his words mattered beyond his title and wealth. He loved her gentleness with the sick and dying, the way she could calm a frightened child with a few soft words, or ease an elderly patient's pain with her mere presence. He loved her strength, the quiet fortitude that allowed her to face heartbreaking situations day after day without becoming hardened or cynical. He loved her unwavering conviction that every life held value regardless of circumstance of birth, a belief so fundamental to her character that she could not have abandoned it any more than she could have stopped breathing. Georgiana, for her part, tried desperately not to love him in return. She knew the folly of their situation with a clarity that came from years of understanding her place in the rigid hierarchy of English society. The Earl of Stratford might be kind to her, might speak with her as if she were his equal in those stolen moments in the parish garden, but he was engaged to a princess. He would marry into royalty, cementing his family's already considerable power, while she would remain here among the orphans and the sick, content with the purpose she had found in service. Yet her treacherous heart refused to listen to reason. She found herself waiting for his visits, her pulse quickening at the sound of his voice in the entrance hall. She noticed everything about him, the way he pushed his hair back when he was thinking, creating that slight dishevelment that made him look younger and less formal. She noticed the rare smile that softened the aristocratic angles of his face, transforming him from the remote lord into someone warm and approachable. She noticed the gentleness in his hands when he helped her lift a heavy bucket or carry supplies, the way his fingers would linger just a moment longer than strictly necessary. She began to dream, dangerous dreams of a life that could never be hers, and woke each morning resolving to guard her heart more carefully. But her resolutions crumbled the moment he appeared in the garden gate, his face lighting with genuine pleasure at the sight of her, and she knew she was fighting a battle already lost. The other volunteers at St. Bartholomew's noticed the Earl's frequent visits and drew their own conclusions. Mrs. Martha Whittington, a widow who had worked at the parish for 15 years, took it upon herself to warn Georgiana about the dangers of forming attachments to men so far above her station. "He is a kind man, the Earl," Mrs. Whittington said one afternoon, as they prepared bandages together in the supply room. "But he is engaged to be married, child, and not to the likes of us. You must guard your heart." "I know, Mrs. Whittington," Georgiana replied quietly, her hands continuing their work with practiced efficiency. "I am under no illusions about my place in the world." "I see how you look at him," the older woman continued, her voice gentle but insistent. "And more importantly, I see how he looks at you. That way lies nothing but heartbreak, my dear, for both of you." Georgiana wanted to protest, to insist that there was nothing improper in her interactions with the Earl, but she knew it would be a lie. There was everything improper in the way her heart soared when he smiled at her, in the way she found herself counting the hours until his next visit, in the dreams that haunted her sleep, where impossible things became real. It was on a warm May afternoon, nearly 6 weeks after their first meeting, that the careful dance Nicholas and Georgiana had been performing finally came to its inevitable conclusion. The morning had begun with the usual arduous routine at St. Bartholomew's parish. Georgiana had risen before dawn in the small room she rented, in a boarding house 3 streets away, a cramped space under the eaves that she could barely afford on the modest stipend Father Duckett managed to provide from the parish funds. She had dressed in her usual grey gown, pinned her dark hair into its customary bun, and walked through the waking streets of London to begin her day's work. By mid-afternoon, she had tended to 24 patients, helped prepare meals for the orphans, and spent an hour teaching the older children their letters. She was tired in the bone-deep way that came from constant labor, but it was a good tiredness, the kind that came from knowing one had spent the day in meaningful service. She had retreated to the garden for a few moments of respite, kneeling beside a bed of herbs to check for signs of the aphids that had been plaguing the mint plants. The May sun was warm on her back, and the air carried the mixed scents of growing things and distant coal smoke, the perpetual perfume of London. She did not hear Nicholas approach, so absorbed was she in her work. It was only when his shadow fell across the herbs that she looked up and found him standing there, still dressed in his riding clothes, as if he had come directly from Hyde Park. His expression was troubled, his eyes holding a turbulence she had never seen before. "My lord," she said, rising quickly and brushing dirt from her hands. "I did not hear you arrive." "Georgiana," he said, and the use of her given name, spoken in that low, urgent voice, sent a shiver through her despite the warmth of the day. "May I speak with you, privately?" She should have refused, she should have insisted on a chaperone, should have reminded him of propriety and her place. Instead, she found herself nodding and following him to the far corner of the garden, where a small bench sat beneath the apple tree, its branches just beginning to show the first blush of blooms. They sat, not touching, but close enough that Georgiana could feel the heat radiating from his body, could catch the scent of sandalwood and horses that clung to his clothes. For a long moment, Nicholas said nothing, simply staring at his hands clasped before him, as if searching for the right words. "Miss Fletcher," he began, then stopped and shook his head. "Georgiana, may I call you Georgiana?" She froze, her hands stilling in her lap, understanding that something was shifting between them, a sacred declaration that could not be retracted once acknowledged. "My lord, I do not think that would be proper," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Nothing about what I feel for you is proper," Nicholas replied, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer contain. "I have tried, God knows I have tried, to be sensible, to remember my obligations, my engagement, my duty to my family and to England. But Georgiana, I cannot seem to remember any of it when I am near you." "Pray do not utter such sentiments," Georgiana whispered, her voice breaking. Tears began to burn behind her eyes, threatening to spill over. "You are bound to Princess Sophia. You will marry her in a few months. Your honor demands you fulfill your duty to the crown." "And if I do not wish to?" Nicholas asked, turning to face her fully. "If I told you that every moment I spend away from you is torment, that I lie awake at night thinking of your voice, your laugh, the way you care for those children as if they were your own, what would you say then?" Tears spilled down her cheeks regardless. She had known this moment would come, had both dreaded and longed for it, but now that it was here, she found herself unprepared for the violence of her own emotions. "I would say that you are speaking of follies, my lord," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am nobody. The daughter of a country vicar with no family, no dowry, no connections. You are an earl, engaged to a princess. The Prince Regent himself approved your match. To break such an engagement would be political suicide. Your family would never forgive you. Society would destroy you." "I know all of this," Nicholas said urgently, reaching out to take her hands in his own. His touch sent electricity through her, warm and vital and utterly forbidden. He continued, the intensity of his voice a palpable force. "I have thought of nothing else for weeks. I have examined every angle, every consequence. I have consulted with my solicitors, spoken to trusted advisors, calculated the political and social costs, and still I come back to the same truth. I love you, Georgiana. I have loved you since the moment I saw you holding that sick child, as if he were the most important person in the world. I love your compassion, your strength, your complete disregard for the artificial hierarchies that govern the rest of us. I love you, and I cannot marry another woman while knowing that you exist." "You do not know what you are saying," Georgiana said desperately, pulling her hands from his and standing abruptly. She moved away from the bench, putting distance between them as if that might somehow make this conversation less real. "This is madness. You have spent too many weeks in this place, away from your own world. When you return to your townhouse, to your responsibilities, you will remember who you are and who I am, and you will see how impossible this is." "Then let me prove otherwise," Nicholas said, rising to face her. "Let me break this engagement. Let me court you properly in the open, before God and society. Let me show you that my love is not a passing fancy, but the truest thing I have ever felt." "And when the Prince Regent withdraws his favor?" Georgiana challenged, turning to face him with tears streaming down her face. "When your family disowns you, when society closes its doors to you, what then, my lord? Will your love sustain you when you have lost everything?" "It will have to," Nicholas said simply, and the quiet certainty in his voice shook her more than any passionate declaration could have. "Because I cannot live a lie any longer. I cannot stand at an altar and promise myself to Sophia when every part of my being belongs to you. I would rather be ruined and honest than celebrated and false." "You speak of ruin as if it were a romantic notion," Georgiana said, her voice rising with frustration and fear. "But ruin is real, my lord. It is doors closed in your face and former friends crossing the street to avoid you. It is watching your family suffer the consequences of your choices. It is knowing that you destroyed not just your own future, but that of everyone connected to you." "You speak as if you know," Nicholas observed, his eyes searching her face. Georgiana was silent for a long moment, then spoke words she had never shared with anyone at St. Bartholomew's. "My father was a vicar in a small parish in Gloucestershire," she said quietly. "A good man, beloved by his congregation. But he made the mistake of defending a young woman who had been seduced and abandoned by the local squire's son. He spoke out from the pulpit about the injustice of a system that punished the woman while the man went free. The squire had my father removed from his living. We were cast out with nowhere to go, no income, no friends willing to help us, for fear of the squire's displeasure." She paused, the memory still painful even after 3 years. "My father died within 6 months, his health broken by the stress and poverty. My mother followed him less than a year later. I know what it means to pay the price for standing against the powerful, my lord. I watched it destroy my parents. I will not watch it destroy you." Nicholas closed the distance between them, taking her shoulders gently in his hands and forcing her to meet his eyes. "What happened to your parents was a terrible injustice," he said. He continued, his voice low and firm, justifying his choice with the knowledge of his resources, reinforcing his agency as an earl. "But it is not the same as what I propose. I am not some country vicar dependent on the whims of a local squire. I am an earl with substantial independent means, properties that cannot be taken from me, investments that provide income regardless of society's approval. Yes, I will lose political appointments and social standing. Yes, my family will be angry and disappointed, but I will not starve, Georgiana, we will not starve." "But we will be alone," Georgiana said, "cut off from everyone you know and love. Is that truly a life you want?" "If it is a life with you, then yes," Nicholas replied without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of fear and longing for Georgiana. Nicholas had left the parish that afternoon with a determination that terrified her, refusing to accept her arguments about the folly of their situation. She heard nothing from him for days, and she told herself it was for the best, that he had come to his senses and recognized the madness of his declarations. She tried to lose herself in her work, to find solace in the familiar routines of caring for the sick and teaching the children. But everything reminded her of Nicholas, the garden where they had spoken of impossible things, the entrance hall where she would hear his voice and feel her heart leap, the bench beneath the apple tree where he had first spoken her name with such tenderness. Mrs. Whittington watched her with concerned eyes, but said nothing, offering only silent support in the form of cups of tea pressed into her hands and gentle reminders to eat when Georgiana pushed away her meals untouched. Then on the 14th day after Nicholas's declaration in the garden, news reached even the humble parish of St. Bartholomew. Father Duckett burst into the charity house mid-morning, his round face flushed with exertion, and his breath coming in gasps as if he had been running. In his hand he clutched a newspaper, one of the gossip rags that circulated among London society, and his expression was a mixture of shock and distress. "Miss Fletcher," he called out, his voice carrying through the building. "Miss Fletcher, where are you?" Georgiana emerged from the supply room where she had been counting linens, her heart already beginning to pound with premonition. Something had happened, something terrible. "What is it, Father?" she asked, moving quickly to his side. The priest simply handed her the newspaper, his hand trembling slightly. Georgiana took it and began to read, her eyes scanning the headlines until they found the one that made her blood run cold. Earl of Stratford breaks engagement to Princess Sophia. Shocking scandal rocks London society. Foreign princess humiliated as Earl claims affections engaged elsewhere. The article went on to describe in breathless detail how Nicholas had formally dissolved his engagement to Princess Sophia of Hanover, sending word through his solicitors that he could not in good conscience marry the princess when his heart belonged to another. The Prince Regent was said to be apoplectic with rage at the insult to the House of Hanover. The diplomatic complications were already mounting, with the German states expressing outrage at the treatment of their princess. Nicholas's mother, the Dowager Countess, had taken to her bed with shock and was refusing to see her son. Society was in an uproar, the article reported with evident glee. Who was this mystery woman who had captured the Earl's heart so completely that he would sacrifice his reputation, his political future, his standing with the crown itself? Speculation was rampant, with various ladies' names being whispered in ballrooms and drawing rooms across London. Georgiana felt the blood drain from her face, her hands beginning to shake so violently that she nearly dropped the newspaper. Father Duckett caught her elbow, guiding her to a nearby chair before she could collapse. "He actually did it," she whispered, the words barely audible. "He destroyed himself for me." "Is it true, then?" Father Duckett asked gently. "Has the Earl formed an attachment to you?" Georgiana could only nod, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She felt as if she were drowning, waves of panic and guilt and desperate hope crashing over her in equal measure. "Oh, my child," the priest said sadly, "what have you done?" "I tried to stop him," Georgiana said, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I told him it was impossible. I begged him to think of the consequences, but he would not listen." For the next 2 days, Georgiana moved through her duties at the parish like a ghost, her body performing familiar tasks while her mind remained trapped in a loop of horror and disbelief. The other volunteers treated her with a mixture of sympathy and wariness, uncertain how to respond to the scandal that had touched even their humble establishment. Mrs. Whittington said nothing, but her presence was a constant comfort, always nearby when Georgiana needed a steadying hand or a moment of silent companionship. The newspapers continued their frenzied speculation, each edition bringing new theories about the mystery woman and new details about the fallout from Nicholas's decision. His political appointments had been revoked. His name had been struck from the guest lists of every major house in London. Former allies were publicly distancing themselves from him. His family was said to be in a state of complete upheaval, with his younger brother reportedly furious at the damage done to the Stratford name. Through it all, Georgiana heard nothing directly from Nicholas himself, and she did not know whether to be relieved or devastated by his silence. Then on the 3rd morning after the scandal broke, he came. Georgiana was in the garden, mechanically tending to the vegetable beds, though she could not have said what she was planting. Her hands moved through familiar motions while her mind remained numb, refusing to fully process the enormity of what had happened. She heard the gate open but did not turn, assuming it was one of the children come to help with the gardening. It was only when she heard his voice, rough and exhausted but unmistakably his, that she froze. "Georgiana." She turned slowly, almost afraid to look, and found Nicholas standing at the garden gate. He looked terrible, his face drawn with strain and exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes speaking of sleepless nights. His clothes, while still of fine quality, were rumpled as if he had been wearing them for days without rest. But his eyes, when they found hers, were blazing with an intensity that took her breath away. "Walk with me," he said simply, offering his arm. "Please." Georgiana should have refused. She should have sent him away, told him she wanted nothing to do with the ruin he had brought upon himself. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was madness, that nothing good could come from this association. But she could no more deny him than she could stop her own heart from beating. She rose on trembling legs, brushed the dirt from her hands with movements made clumsy by emotion, and placed her hand on his offered arm. She felt him tense at her touch, as if her acceptance had been uncertain, and then relaxed slightly as they began to walk. They left the parish grounds and walked through the narrow streets of the neighborhood, Nicholas, heedless of the stares his presence drew. A gentleman of his obvious quality did not frequent these poor areas, and their passage attracted attention from shopkeepers and street vendors alike. But Nicholas seemed oblivious to everything, except the woman at his side. He led her to a small church, St. Mary's, tucked away on a quiet lane several streets from the parish. It was a modest building, its stone walls blackened by years of coal smoke, its windows narrow and high. Nicholas pushed open the heavy wooden door and drew Georgiana inside the cool shadowed interior of the church. The church was empty, silent except for the distant sounds of the city filtering through the thick walls. Candles flickered on the altar, their light creating pools of golden warmth in the surrounding darkness. The air smelled of beeswax and incense and old stone, familiar scents that spoke of centuries of prayer and devotion. Nicholas led her to a pew near the front and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. For a long moment he simply looked at her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination, and something that looked almost like fear. "I have broken my engagement," Nicholas said without preamble, his voice echoing softly in the empty church. "The Prince Regent has revoked his favor. My mother refuses to speak to me. My father's former associates have withdrawn their political support. My brother has written me a letter, expressing his disappointment and anger at the damage I have done to the family name. Society is tearing apart my character and speculating madly about your identity, though I have revealed nothing that would expose you to their cruelty." "Why?" Georgiana asked, though she knew the answer, needed to hear him say it again. Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with emotion. "Why would you do this?" Nicholas raised one hand to cup her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Because my heart belongs to you," he said simply. "Because I looked at the life that lay before me, a life of duty and political maneuvering and loveless union, and I could not bear it. Because you have shown me what it means to live with purpose, to measure one's worth not by title or position, but by the good one does in the world. Because I would rather be ruined with you than celebrated with anyone else." "You have lost everything," Georgiana whispered, fresh tears streaming down her face. "Your position, your political future, your family's favor, the respect of society. How can you not regret this?" "I regret only the pain I have caused others," Nicholas said honestly. "I regret hurting Sophia, who deserved a loving husband. She is a good woman, and she did not deserve to be humiliated in this way. I regret disappointing my mother, who had such hopes for this match, who saw in it the culmination of years of careful planning and social maneuvering. I regret the scandal that will touch my family name and make my brother's path more difficult. But I do not regret loving you, Georgiana. I could never regret that." "I am nothing," Georgiana said desperately, pulling away from him and moving to stand before the altar, as if seeking strength from the sacred space around them. "I have no family, no fortune, no position. I'm the daughter of a disgraced vicar who died in poverty. What can I possibly give you that is worth what you have sacrificed?" Nicholas came to stand beside her, his presence solid and warm in the cool church. "Yourself," he said simply. "Your honesty, your compassion, your strength, the way you make me want to be better than I am. The knowledge that when I am with you, I am the man I was meant to be rather than the titled cipher society expected me to become. That is worth everything I have lost and more." "Society will never accept me," Georgiana said, staring at the candles flickering on the altar. "They will call me an adventuress, a schemer who seduced you away from your proper match. They will say I used my position at the parish to entrap you, that I calculated every moment to ensnare an earl. They will make your life miserable with their contempt and their gossip. Then we will face that misery together," Nicholas said, taking her hand and drawing her back to face him. "Marry me, Georgiana, here, today, in this church. Let me make you my countess before God and whatever witnesses we can find. Let me prove that my love is not words but action, not passing fancy, but eternal commitment." Georgiana stared at him, her mind reeling. "You cannot truly want this," she protested weakly, even as her heart soared at his words. "When the reality of what you have done settles in, when you see what you have given up for a woman you barely know, when you experience the full weight of society's disapproval, you will come to resent me. Never, Nicholas said fiercely, his hands gripping hers tightly. "I have made my choice with clear eyes and full knowledge of the consequences. I am not some romantic fool acting on impulse. I am a man of 31 years who has lived his entire life according to other people's expectations and has finally found something worth claiming as his own. I chose you, Georgiana. I will always choose you. The only question is whether you will choose me in return." Georgiana looked at him through her tears, this man who had sacrificed everything for love of her, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. It was madness. It was impossible. It defied every rule of society and sense. But it was also the deepest truth she had ever known. "Yes," she whispered. "God help me, yes." The words had barely left her lips before Nicholas pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. She felt his heart pounding against her chest, felt the tremor that ran through his body, and realized that despite all his certainty, he had not been entirely sure she would accept him. They stood like that for a long moment, simply holding each other in the quiet church, while the candles flickered and the distant sounds of London continued beyond the thick stone walls. Then Nicholas pulled back, his hands framing her face, as he looked into her eyes with such intensity it was almost painful. "I need to find a priest who will marry us," he said. "It may take some time. The scandal has made many clergy nervous about being associated with me. But I will find someone." As if summoned by his words, a door at the side of the church opened, and an elderly priest emerged, his white hair gleaming in the candlelight. He was a thin man with kind eyes, dressed in simple black vestments, and he moved with the careful deliberation of advanced age. "I could not help but overhear," the priest said, his voice carrying the slight accent of Ireland. "And if I may say so, I have been waiting for someone to ask. I am Father Dominic O'Brien, and I would be honored to perform the ceremony." Nicholas turned to face the priest, his expression wary. "You know who I am? You know what I have done?" "I know that you are a man who chose love over duty," Father O'Brien replied with a gentle smile. "And that is always a choice worthy of respect. I have been a priest for 40 years, my lord, and I have married many couples, some for money, some for position, some because they thought they should. But rarely do I see two people who look at each other the way you and this young woman do. That is a sacred thing, and I will not turn away from it." And so they were married that very afternoon in St. Mary's Chapel, with Father O'Brien performing the ceremony and two parishioners pulled in from the street to serve as witnesses. One was an elderly woman who wept throughout the entire service, moved by the obvious emotion between the bride and groom. The other was a young laborer who seemed bemused by the entire proceeding, but signed his name to the marriage certificate with careful dignity. It was nothing like the grand society wedding Nicholas would have had with Princess Sophia. There was no elaborate ceremony at St. James's Chapel with the Prince Regent in attendance, no hundreds of titled guests in their finest clothes, no musicians or elaborate flowers or wedding breakfast that would be talked about for seasons to come. Instead, there was simplicity and sincerity. Georgiana, in her worn grey dress, her only adornment the roses Nicholas had somehow procured, their pink petals soft against the plain fabric. Nicholas, in his rumpled clothes, his hair pushed back from his forehead, his eyes never leaving her face. Father O'Brien's gentle Irish voice leading them through the ancient vows, the two witnesses watching with expressions of wonder and sympathy. When Nicholas slid the simple gold band onto her finger, Georgiana felt tears stream down her face. The ring was warm from his pocket, solid and real against her skin, physical proof that this impossible thing was actually happening. "I, Nicholas Henry Cavendish, take you, Georgiana Rose Fletcher, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Nicholas said, his voice strong and clear despite the emotion that roughened it. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Georgiana repeated the vows in a voice that trembled but did not break, her eyes locked with his, both of them acutely aware of the magnitude of what they were promising. For better or worse, they both knew that worse was coming, that the society they had defied would exact its price. But in that moment, standing before God and these simple witnesses, none of it mattered. "You may kiss your bride," Father O'Brien said with a smile, and Nicholas cupped Georgiana's face in his hands and kissed her for the first time as his wife. It was gentle and reverent and filled with promise, a kiss that spoke of commitment and hope and the beginning of a shared journey. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying, and Father O'Brien had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "Go with God's blessing," the priest said, making the sign of the cross over them. "And may your love be a light in the darkness." The months that followed were as difficult as Georgiana had feared and worse. Nicholas took her to Stratford Manor in Hampshire, his family estate, a journey of several hours in his private carriage. The estate was beautiful, a sprawling Jacobean manor house set among rolling hills and ancient forests, but it felt more like a prison than a home. Nicholas's mother, the Dowager Countess, had fled in a fury to the townhouse in London the moment she heard of her son's marriage, taking with her most of the household's valuables and leaving instructions that Georgiana was to be given as little respect as possible. The servants, loyal to the Dowager Countess and uncertain about this new mistress from nowhere, treated Georgiana with barely concealed disdain. Mrs. Helena Fairweather, the housekeeper who had served the Stratford family for 30 years, made her disapproval abundantly clear from the first moment Georgiana entered the house. She addressed Georgiana with the bare minimum of courtesy, ignored most of her requests, and made it known to the other servants that this new countess was not to be considered a true mistress of the house. The butler, Mr. Edmund Griggs, was only slightly more circumspect, but his cold formality was perhaps more cutting than open hostility would have been. He performed his duties with impeccable correctness, while making it clear through 1,000 small gestures that he considered Georgiana an interloper who had trapped his master into a disastrous marriage. Only a few of the servants showed any kindness to Georgiana. Young Alice Merriweather, a housemaid of perhaps 16 years of age, smiled shyly at her when no one else was looking. Thomas the footman, a quiet man in his 20s, went out of his way to be helpful. And Mrs. Sarah Morton, the cook, prepared special dishes for Georgiana's meals even when Mrs. Fairweather tried to countermand her orders. Society's response was even more brutal than the household's coldness. The Ton closed ranks against them, a wall of aristocratic disapproval that no amount of Nicholas's previous social standing could breach. They were not invited to any events. Their names were struck from guest lists. Former friends crossed the street rather than acknowledge them. The gossip rags had a field day when Georgiana's identity finally became known. They published increasingly wild and insulting theories about how she had ensnared the Earl, painting her as everything from a scheming adventuress to a common prostitute who had used her position at the charity house to trap a wealthy patron. One particularly vicious article described her as a calculating harlot who had deliberately placed herself in the Earl's path, knowing that a man of his charitable nature would be moved by her performance of compassion. Another suggested that she had been trained by a shadowy network of social climbers who specialized in entrapping wealthy men. The speculation about her past was equally cruel. Some articles claimed she was the illegitimate daughter of a nobleman, using her charitable work to gain revenge on the society that had rejected her. Others suggested she had been a governess, dismissed for inappropriate behavior with her employer. One particularly creative piece claimed she was actually a former actress who had decided to aim higher than the stage could provide. Nicholas bore it all with a stoic dignity that broke Georgiana's heart. She watched as he lost political appointments he had held for years, positions that had given meaning and purpose to his life beyond mere social standing. She watched as former allies abandoned him, men who had called him friend for decades, suddenly finding themselves too busy to respond to his correspondence. She watched as the life he had known crumbled around them, and though he never complained, never expressed regret, she could see the toll it took. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. Sometimes she would find him standing at the windows of Stratford Manor, staring out at the Hampshire countryside, with an expression of such sadness that it made her chest ache. At night, when he thought she was asleep, she could hear him pacing their bedchamber, his footsteps a restless pattern on the floorboards. Georgiana tried to be a good wife, to provide comfort and support in the face of their shared ostracism. But she could not escape the crushing guilt that came from knowing she was the cause of his suffering. Every door closed in his face, every former friend who cut him, every political opportunity lost, was a direct result of his choice to marry her. It was 6 months into their marriage on a cold November evening when the first frost had begun to silver the grass outside Stratford Manor that Georgiana reached her breaking point. She found Nicholas in the library, as had become his habit in recent weeks. He spent hours there each day surrounded by books, the beginnings of a new purpose taking shape, reading or writing or simply staring into the fire. When she entered, he looked up with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I cannot do this anymore," Georgiana said without preamble, her voice breaking. "I cannot watch you suffer because of me." Nicholas rose immediately, crossing to her side with concern etched on his face. "Georgiana, what are you saying?" "I am saying that I was wrong to marry you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I am saying that my presence in your life has brought you nothing but pain and loss. I am saying that perhaps an annulment could be obtained, some way to undo the damage I have caused." "No," Nicholas said fiercely, taking her shoulders in his hands. "We are not having this conversation." "But look what I have cost you," Georgiana cried. "Your political career, your family, your place in society, everything you worked for your entire life, gone because of me." "Gone because of my choice," Nicholas corrected. "Never forget that, Georgiana. I chose this, I chose you, and I would choose you again every day for the rest of my life." "But you are miserable," Georgiana insisted. "Do not try to hide it from me. I see you staring out the windows. I hear you pacing at night. You have lost everything that mattered to you." "I have lost things that I thought mattered," Nicholas said, his voice softening. "But Georgiana, listen to me. Those things, those political appointments and social invitations and superficial friendships, they were never what truly mattered. They were the scaffolding of a life, not the life itself. Do you know what truly matters? This. Us. The fact that I wake each morning next to a woman who makes me want to be better than I am. The knowledge that I am living according to my conscience rather than society's demands. That matters. That is real." "But you are not happy," Georgiana whispered. "I am not content with how we are living," Nicholas admitted. "You are right about that. I am not content to hide away in this manor house while society celebrates its victory over us. I am not content to let them define us by our scandal rather than our actions. But that is not the same as regretting my choice to marry you. That I will never regret." "Then what do we do?" Georgiana asked. "How do we live in a world that has closed every door against us?" Nicholas was quiet for a long moment, his hands still resting on her shoulders, his eyes thoughtful. "We open our own doors," he said finally. "We stop trying to regain what we have lost and start building something new, something better, something that matters." It was Georgiana who refused to accept their exile as permanent, who saw in their situation not just disaster, but opportunity. She had spent 3 years serving in a parish for the poor, learning that the most effective way to change hearts was through action rather than words. If society would not accept her on the basis of her marriage to Nicholas, she would earn their acceptance through the force of her compassion and the evidence of her character. With what remained of Nicholas's fortune, the portion his mother could not control as it came from investments in his own name, Georgiana established a charitable foundation unlike any London had seen before. She called it the Stratford Foundation for the Welfare of the Poor, and she poured into it all the knowledge she had gained from her years at St. Bartholomew's Parish, combined with the resources of an earl's wife and the determination of a woman with everything to prove. Her first project was to establish a school for orphans, but not the grim workhouses where children learned only to labor and obey. She created a genuine school where they were taught to read and write and cipher, where they learned trades that could support them with dignity rather than mere survival. She hired teachers, real teachers with training and dedication, and paid them well enough that they could focus on their work rather than constantly seeking other employment. She established hospitals for the sick poor, bringing in trained physicians and insisting on cleanliness and proper treatment regardless of the patient's ability to pay. She studied the latest medical texts, consulted with progressive doctors who were willing to work with her despite the scandal surrounding her name, and implemented standards of care that were revolutionary for the time. She created apprenticeship programs to give young people from impoverished backgrounds the skills to support themselves with dignity. She convinced craftsmen and merchants to take on poor youths as apprentices, using the foundation's resources to cover the costs that usually prevented such opportunities. She followed up with each apprentice, ensuring they were being treated fairly and receiving proper training. And she did it all in the most public way possible, forcing society to see her not as a schemer who had seduced an earl, but as a woman of genuine compassion and tireless dedication. Nicholas stood beside her through all of it, attending every charity event, every fundraising appeal, supporting her vision even as London society continued to shun them. He used his connections with merchants and bankers, men who cared more about practical results than social scandal, to secure funding and support. He wrote articles for progressive publications, using his title and education to draw attention to the plight of the poor and the need for systemic change. Together, they became a force that society could not ignore, no matter how much it might wish to. It took time. Months stretched into a year, then 2. The work was exhausting, physically and emotionally draining in ways Georgiana had not anticipated. There were days when she wanted to give up, when the weight of society's disapproval and the enormity of the problems they were trying to address seemed overwhelming. But Nicholas was always there, steady and supportive, reminding her of why they had chosen this path. Gradually, imperceptibly at first, attitudes began to shift. The common people loved Georgiana. They called her the Angel of Stratford, and they spoke in hushed tones of the Countess who cared as much for a beggar's child as for a duke's daughter. Stories spread of her kindness, her refusal to turn anyone away, the way she knelt beside dying patients and held their hands as they took their final breaths. When she walked through the East End, people would stop to thank her, to touch her hand, to whisper blessings. The newspapers began to cover the Foundation's work, at first with mocking skepticism, but increasingly with grudging respect. It was hard to maintain a narrative of scheming adventuress when the evidence of genuine charitable work was so overwhelming. Journalists who came to write exposés found themselves instead writing about the clean, well-run schools and hospitals, the children who were learning to read, the sick who were receiving treatment they could never have afforded otherwise. When an outbreak of cholera swept through the East End in the summer of 1820, it was Georgiana's hospitals that saved hundreds of lives. She worked tirelessly alongside her doctors and nurses, ignoring Nicholas's pleas that she protect herself from the disease. The epidemic raged for 3 terrible weeks, and when it finally passed, the death toll in the areas served by the Stratford Foundation was significantly lower than in comparable neighborhoods. Even the most cynical journalists could not deny the evidence of her impact. Articles appeared praising her courage and dedication, noting that this supposed schemer had risked her own life to save others. Gradually, the narrative began to shift from scandal to grudging admiration. The turning point came when Lady Beatrice Sinclair, a widow known for her progressive views and her willingness to defy social conventions, publicly declared her support for the Stratford Foundation. Lady Sinclair was wealthy, influential, and possessed of a sharp tongue that made even the most powerful members of the ton wary of crossing her. She had observed the Foundation's work for months, visiting its schools and hospitals unannounced, speaking with the staff and the people being served. And she had come away convinced that Georgiana was not a schemer, but a genuine force for good in London. At a dinner party attended by several members of the ton, Lady Sinclair made her opinion known in her typically blunt fashion. "You are all fools," she told the assembled guests, her voice carrying clearly through the dining room. "You have spent 3 years cutting a woman whose only crime was to inspire love in a man brave enough to claim it. Meanwhile, she has built schools and hospitals, saved lives, given hope to thousands. And you concern yourselves with scandal and propriety while Rome burns around you." The comment caused a stir, with several guests objecting to her characterization, but Lady Sinclair was unmoved. "I have met the Countess of Stratford," she continued. "I have seen her work. I have spoken with the children she educates and the patients she treats, and I tell you now she is worth 10 of any woman in this room, myself included. If you choose to continue shunning her, that is your loss. But I will no longer participate in such foolishness." The story of Lady Sinclair's declaration spread through London society within days, carried by servants and repeated in ballrooms and drawing rooms. Some dismissed it as the eccentricity of a woman known for unconventional views, but others, particularly some of the younger generation and more progressive members of society, began to question whether continued ostracism of the Stratfords was truly justified. The Prince Regent himself took notice. It was 3 years after Nicholas had broken his engagement, 3 years of exile and hard work and gradual redemption, that the summons came. A royal messenger arrived at Stratford Manor, bearing a letter sealed with the royal crest, requesting the pleasure of the Earl of Stratford and his Countess at a private audience at St. James's Palace. Nicholas and Georgiana travelled to London with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The Prince Regent was famously capricious, and there was no guarantee that this audience would bring anything but further humiliation. But they had learned to face adversity together, and they entered the palace side by side, dressed in their finest clothes, but prepared for any outcome. The Prince Regent received them in a small antechamber rather than the throne room, a subtle signal that this was to be a personal rather than formal audience. He was a large man in his mid-50s, his face florid and his manner imperious, but his eyes held a surprising sharpness as he studied them. Nicholas and Georgiana both bowed and curtsied deeply, the proper obeisance to royalty, and waited for the Prince Regent to speak. "Lord Stratford," the Prince Regent said without preamble, his voice carrying the particular accent of the upper aristocracy, "you created quite the scandal 3 years ago." "I am aware, Your Royal Highness," Nicholas replied, his voice steady. "I can only apologize for any embarrassment my actions caused to the Crown." "Embarrassment," the Prince Regent repeated, a strange note in his voice that might have been amusement. "Yes, there was certainly that. The diplomatic complications alone were extraordinary. The House of Hanover was most displeased. I received strongly worded letters from no fewer than 5 German princes." He turned his attention to Georgiana, who kept her eyes lowered, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "And you, Countess," the Prince Regent continued, "you are the woman for whom my Earl threw away his political future and insulted a foreign princess." "I did not ask for his lordship's regard, Your Royal Highness," Georgiana said quietly but clearly, knowing that to show fear before royalty was to invite contempt. "I tried to dissuade him from his course, but I cannot regret the outcome." "Interesting," the Prince Regent said, circling them slowly like a predator assessing prey. "Do you know what I see when I look at you two? I see a man who chose love over duty and a woman who has worked tirelessly to prove herself worthy of that choice. I see the Stratford Foundation, which has done more good for London's poor in 3 years than most aristocrats accomplish in a decade. I see hospitals and schools and children who might otherwise have died now thriving." He paused before Nicholas, meeting his eyes directly. "I also see that the scandal has passed, my lord. 3 years is long enough for even the Tun's appetite for gossip. The House of Hanover has made a different alliance. Princess Sophia is happily married to Prince Frederick of Bavaria, a match that some say suits her better than yours ever would have. The political damage has been mitigated through careful diplomacy and judicious marriages among your former associates." "Your Royal Highness," Nicholas said carefully, hardly daring to hope. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I am prepared to extend my favor once more," the Prince Regent replied. "Not complete restoration, mind you. You will never again hold the political appointments you once did. The insult to the House of Hanover, though forgiven, cannot be completely forgotten, but I will no longer actively oppose your place in society. If the Tun chooses to receive you, I will not prevent it. Indeed, I may even encourage it." Georgiana felt tears spring to her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined to maintain her composure before the Prince Regent. "Your Royal Highness is most generous," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. "I am practical," the Prince Regent corrected, his expression softening slightly. "You have proven yourself, Countess, in the most difficult of circumstances. You took a situation that could have ended in bitterness and resentment and transformed it into something productive and admirable. And you, Stratford, have proven that love can indeed triumph over duty when paired with dedication to the common good. England needs more such examples, not fewer. He dismissed them shortly after with a gesture that was almost friendly, and as they left the antechamber, Georgiana felt as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The Prince Regent's favor was not everything, but it was something. A door, long closed, had cracked open once more. The impact of the royal audience reverberated through London society within days. If the Prince Regent no longer opposed the Stratfords, then the Ton was free to receive them once more. It would not happen overnight, but the wall that had seemed impenetrable 3 years ago was beginning to show cracks. The test came 6 weeks later, when Lady Hastings, one of London's most prominent hostesses and a woman known for her impeccable social instincts, sent an invitation to a grand ball at the Hastings residence. It was the first invitation Georgiana and Nicholas had received to a society event since their marriage, and they understood it for what it was: a trial. If they were received well at the Hastings ball, other invitations would follow. If they failed, the door would close again, perhaps permanently. Georgiana stood before the mirror in her dressing room at Stratford Manor the evening of the ball, studying her reflection with a critical eye. Alice Merriweather, the young housemaid who had shown her kindness from the beginning, and whom Georgiana had promoted to the position, worked carefully on her hair, creating an elegant arrangement that was both fashionable and appropriate. She wore a gown of deep blue silk, the finest she had ever owned, cut in the latest fashion with a modest neckline and elegant lines that flattered her figure. The fabric had cost more than Georgiana had earned in a year at St. Bartholomew's parish, and she had initially balked at the expense, but Nicholas had insisted, arguing that she needed to look every inch the Countess if she was to face London society on its own terms. Her only jewellery was her mother's pearl necklace, her only inheritance simple but elegant against the blue silk. Her hands, which had once been rough from work at the parish, had softened somewhat over 3 years, though they would never have the pampered smoothness of ladies who had never worked. She looked every inch the Countess she had become, but she could not shake the memory of the girl in the worn dress kneeling in the dirt of St. Bartholomew's garden. "You are beautiful, my lady," Alice said softly, making a final adjustment to a curl. "They will see that tonight." "You are beautiful," Nicholas said from the doorway, and Georgiana turned to find him watching her with the same intensity he had shown on the day they met. He looked magnificent in his evening clothes, every inch the aristocrat he was born to be, his dark hair perfectly arranged, his cravat tied in an intricate knot. "You have always been beautiful, but tonight you are luminous." "I am terrified," Georgiana confessed, rising from her dressing table to face him. "What if all our work has been for nothing?" "Then we will continue as we have been," Nicholas said, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "We will continue building our schools and hospitals. We will continue loving each other. We will continue proving through our actions that the choice we made was the right one. But Georgiana, I do not believe we will be rejected. I have watched you over these 3 years. I have seen you transform lives and hearts. Society cannot ignore that forever." "You have lost so much for me," Georgiana said softly, a familiar refrain between them. "Your political career, your mother's affection, years of your life spent in social exile. Do you ever regret it? Truly?" "Never," Nicholas said fiercely, pulling her close. "Not once, not for a single moment. These 3 years with you have been more meaningful than all the years that came before. You have taught me what it means to live with purpose, to measure success not by position or power, but by the good we do in the world. You have made me a better man, Georgiana. How could I ever regret that?" The Hastings ball was everything Georgiana had imagined and feared. The townhouse blazed with light from hundreds of candles in crystal chandeliers, their flames reflected in gilded mirrors and polished marble floors until the entire space seemed to glow. Ladies in elaborate gowns of silk and satin, their necks adorned with jewels worth more than most families earned in a decade, moved through the rooms in a rustle of expensive fabric. Gentlemen in impeccable evening dress clustered in groups, their conversations a low hum beneath the music of the orchestra, tuning their instruments in the ballroom. The butler announced their arrival in a carrying voice that cut through the ambient noise. The Earl and Countess of Stratford. The silence was immediate and profound. 300 members of London's elite turned as one to stare at the couple who had scandalized society 3 years before. Georgiana felt her cheeks flush under the weight of their scrutiny, felt the familiar urge to shrink into herself, to make herself small and invisible. But she kept her head high and her hand steady on Nicholas's arm as they descended the stairs into the ballroom. She could see the calculation in their faces, the weighing of scandal against royal favor, the consideration of how much the Stratford Foundation's work had altered the equation. She could see curiosity, skepticism, lingering disapproval, and in a few faces, something that might have been sympathy or respect. Lady Hastings approached them, her expression unreadable. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, tall and regal, her silver hair dressed in an elaborate style that would have taken her maid hours to achieve. She was a leader of society whose approval or disapproval could make or break a social reputation, and Georgiana had heard stories of her cutting wit and exacting standards. For a long moment, Lady Hastings simply studied them, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of their appearance and bearing. Georgiana felt as if she were being dissected, every aspect of her person examined and judged. She forced herself to meet Lady Hastings's gaze directly, to stand with dignity rather than cowering under the scrutiny. Then Lady Hastings smiled, and the tension in the room eased fractionally. "Lord Stratford," Lady Hastings said, her voice carrying in the quiet. "How delightful to see you again after such a long absence. And Countess, I have been most eager to make your acquaintance. The work of your foundation has been quite remarkable." "I value the opportunity to address you, Lady Hastings," Georgiana replied, curtsying gracefully. "I am honored to be received in your home." "The honor is mine, I assure you," Lady Hastings said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she meant it. She gave a slight nod. "I believe you will find my guests most desirous of being associated with the Stratford Foundation's next project." Over the following hours, Georgiana and Nicholas moved through the ballroom, meeting and conversing with members of society who had shunned them for years. Some were openly curious, peppering Georgiana with questions about the Foundation's work and her motivations. Others were grudgingly respectful, acknowledging her accomplishments while maintaining a careful distance. A few were genuinely warm, like Lady Beatrice Sinclair, who embraced Georgiana and declared loudly that it was about time society came to its senses. Georgiana spoke with intelligence and passion about her charity work, fielding questions about funding and operations with the expertise of someone who had lived and breathed the foundation for 3 years. She described the school's curriculum, the hospital's standards of care, the apprenticeship program's success rates. She painted a picture not of Lady Bountiful dispensing charity from on high, but of systematic, thoughtful work to address the root causes of poverty and suffering. Several ladies expressed interest in supporting the Foundation's work, and Georgiana found herself explaining how they might become involved. Others asked about specific projects, wondering if similar programs might be established in their own regions. The conversation flowed naturally, and Georgiana realized with surprise that she was actually enjoying herself. The turning point came when Lady Hastings publicly announced a substantial donation to the Stratford Foundation in front of the assembled guests. She called for silence, raised her glass and spoke in a voice that carried through the ballroom. "I have had the privilege of observing the Stratford Foundation's work over the past year," Lady Hastings said. "I have visited the schools and hospitals, spoken with the staff and the people being served, and I can say without hesitation that it is the most effective charitable work I have witnessed in my 63 years. Therefore, I am pleased to announce that I will be donating £10,000 to support the Foundation's expansion." A ripple of astonishment moved through the crowd. £10,000 was an enormous sum, a donation that signaled not just approval, but enthusiastic endorsement. Other ladies immediately followed suit, competing to show their own charitable inclinations and perhaps curry favor with Lady Hastings. By the end of the evening, Georgiana had secured funding for 3 new schools and an expansion of her hospital system. "You have triumphed," Nicholas murmured in her ear as they danced the final waltz of the evening. His hand was warm at her waist, his steps confident and smooth. "They acknowledged the light, my love. It was never the title, but the substance they lacked the courage to face." "Society has accepted our work," Georgiana corrected gently, her hand resting on his shoulder. "That is more important than mere social approval. If we must be received in order to do good, Then I will accept it. But I will never forget who I was or where I came from. I will never forget the children at St. Bartholomew's, or the lessons I learned kneeling in that garden. That is why I love you, Nicholas said simply, his eyes holding hers, because you have never let go of what truly matters. In the years that followed, the Stratfords became fixtures of London society once more, but on their own terms. They attended events selectively, choosing those where they might advance the foundation's work or build useful alliances. They hosted their own gatherings, salons where progressive thinkers and charitable workers mingled with sympathetic members of the aristocracy. Georgiana's foundation expanded until it operated in every major city in England, its schools and hospitals serving thousands of children and families. She became known not just as the Angel of Stratford, but as one of the most influential women in England, her opinions sought on matters of social reform and public welfare. She advised members of Parliament on legislation affecting the poor, testified before committees, wrote articles that were published in progressive journals. Nicholas, freed from the political ambitions that had once driven him, found new purpose as a writer and advocate. He published essays on social reform, using his title and position to draw attention to the plight of the poor and the need for systemic change. His work was influential, cited by reformers and progressives across the country. He sat on the boards of multiple charitable organizations, always pushing for more effective, more compassionate approaches to helping those in need. Their marriage deepened with each passing year, forged in the crucible of scandal and hardship into something unbreakable. They had learned that true love was not the passionate declarations of early romance, but the quiet choice made every day to support, encourage, and believe in each other, even when the world stood against them. They had learned that adversity shared could strengthen rather than weaken bonds, that purpose shared could create a partnership more profound than mere affection. Nicholas's mother, the Dowager Countess, eventually softened her stance, though it took 5 years and the birth of her first grandchild to fully reconcile her to the marriage. She attended family gatherings with stiff formality at first, but gradually her interactions with Georgiana became warmer, more genuine. She never quite apologized for her initial rejection, but she acknowledged in her own way that she had been wrong. 13 years after their wedding in St. Mary's Chapel, Georgiana stood on the terrace of Stratford Manor, watching the sunset paint the Hampshire countryside in shades of gold and crimson. The manor house had become a true home over the years, no longer the hostile fortress it had been when she first arrived. The servants respected her now, some genuinely fond of her, others at least accepting of her authority. Inside the house, she could hear the laughter of their 3 children. William was 11, named for Nicholas's father, who had died 2 years after their marriage without ever reconciling with his son. Charlotte was 8, named for Georgiana's mother, and little Thomas was 5, named for no one in particular, but simply because they both loved the name. Their children, evidence of a love that had created not just a family but a legacy of compassion and service, were being raised with an understanding of their privilege and their responsibility, taught from an early age that position brought not just rights, but obligations. They spent time at the foundation's schools and hospitals, learning to see the poor as fellow human beings rather than abstract objects of charity. Nicholas joined her on the terrace, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her close. He was 44 now, threads of silver appearing in his dark hair, lines at the corners of his eyes that came from laughter and concentration rather than worry. But his eyes still held the same intensity they had shown the day they met in St. Bartholomew's parish. "Do you remember when I first saw you?" Nicholas asked, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. "Kneeling beside that sick child, caring for him as if he were a prince rather than an orphan." "I remember," Georgiana said, leaning into his embrace. "I remember thinking you looked out of place, a fine gentleman in a poor parish. I never imagined that gentleman would turn my entire world upside down. I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen," Nicholas confessed. "Not beautiful in the way society defines it, but beautiful in the way saints are beautiful in paintings, filled with grace and purpose, and an inner light that made everything else seem dim by comparison." "You gave up everything for me," Georgiana said, as she had said countless times over their years together. "Your position, your political future, your family's favor. I still struggle to comprehend the magnitude of that sacrifice." "It was no sacrifice," Nicholas replied, as he always did. "It was the first truly important choice I ever made. Every decision before that had been driven by duty or expectation, or the need to maintain my position. Choosing you, choosing love, choosing to live according to my conscience rather than society's demands, that was the moment I became the man I was meant to be." "Our daughter asked me about the scandal today," Georgiana said. She had heard from one of her tutors about how we married, about the broken engagement and the years of exile. She wanted to know if it had been worth it. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that advantages are borrowed, not possessed, and that we must use them wisely while we have them," Georgiana said. "I told her that her father had been given every advantage of birth and position, and he had the courage to risk it all when he saw a greater purpose. I told her that love is not just a feeling but a choice, a commitment to build something meaningful together even when the world stands against you." "She will remember that," Nicholas said. "Our children will carry forward what we have begun. The foundation will continue long after we are gone. The schools and hospitals we built will serve generations yet unborn. That is our true legacy, not my title or your charitable reputation, but the lives we have touched and the futures we have made possible." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky and the first stars appeared in the darkening blue above. Inside the house, their children called for them, eager to share some discovery or accomplishment before bedtime. The world continued around them, full of need and opportunity, challenge and joy. Georgiana thought of the girl she had been 13 years ago, kneeling in the dirt of a parish garden, believing herself to be nobody of importance. She thought of the impossibility of their love story, the scandal and hardship they had endured, the slow, painful process of building a life together against the weight of society's disapproval. And she thought of this moment, standing on the terrace of their home with the man she loved, their children safe inside, their life's work flourishing around them. "I would do it all again," she said suddenly, looking up at Nicholas. "Every moment of hardship, every year of exile, every sacrifice. I would do it all again for this, for you, for the life we have built together." "As would I," Nicholas said, bending to kiss her forehead gently. 1,000 times over, without hesitation or regret. "You are my greatest adventure, Georgiana, my greatest triumph, my profoundest blessing." The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky above Stratford Manor, silent witnesses to a love that had defied empire and survived scandal, a love that had transformed not just 2 lives but thousands, a love that proved what Nicholas had declared 13 years earlier in a simple church on a quiet London lane. That true love, freely chosen and steadfastly maintained, was worth any sacrifice, could overcome any obstacle, and would endure long after the whispers of society had faded into forgotten history. Thank you so much for journeying with us through this tale of courage and impossible love. If this story of sacrifice and redemption touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in the power of love to transform lives. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories of hope and resilience to life.